I'm wondering if we should get started or should we wait for the stragglers to come in? It's after 3:30, right? Who says we should get started? All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming to our session. My name is Abdul Sheikh. I'm a program director at the National Cancer Institute, and I'm really excited to be here with this stellar group of panelists that I was lucky to bring together for us today. We've had some amazing discussions leading up to today and over lunch, and so I'm looking forward to have our panelists share their perspectives, and then we're going to end off with some time for Q&A and discussion among the panelists and with the crowd. So let me just jump right in. This is an exciting time, as we know, in health informatics and mHealth and technology and research. And what we're finding is there are these incredible initiatives going on. On the federal side, we see open data. We see healthdata.gov. We see a lot of initiatives and activities and investment in the public and private sectors. The latest I heard was over $1 billion has been invested in 2012 alone into digital health startups, and then that's primarily on the consumer side, but also on the clinical-facing side. So we're seeing all this activity. But what we're also noticing, as you'll recognize, is that there really needs to be more evidence to figure out what applications, what technologies related to behavior, related to health, related to public health, are actually working and which ones aren't, and how can we actually make better evidence-based applications. And so we've seen amazing data coming out of groups including Lauren Abrams at GW, looking at apps in the iPhone store and how most of them are not using the low-hanging fruit of behavioral medicine for smoking cessation apps or for obesity or other related applications. And so there is a problem here. And what we're noticing in some ways is that there's really, in some respects, a growing consumer digital health bubble, because there's all this investment going on in technologies, in applications. But what I'm afraid and what other people are worrying about is, are we going to reach a point where these applications are going to cause a lot of harm, or they're really going to move away the attention that we need to put and the resources that we need to put in the right ways to growing health informatics and technology and mHealth. So with that being said, the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, over the last few years, we've been exploring these open innovation challenges as a way to reach out to ecosystems of innovators and developers and really engage with them and show them, here's our data, here's our evidence. We would love to see you integrate and develop these into your technologies, into your applications for health. And it's been a wonderful experiment for us. So we've also, for instance, had one of our winners, My Cancer Genome, which was developed out of Vanderbilt. It went on from our challenge to win GE's Cancer Data Challenge. They received $100,000 plus venture capital advice and support from GE. We love to see that. We love to see resources being put into applications for health so that they can be further tested, further evaluated, and further assessed for impact. So that the open innovation challenges for us have also allowed us to, as I said, build this group of exchange between innovators and scientists and researchers. It's allowed us to begin to translate the data and the evidence that we have at NCI and NIH for health impact. And it's also allowed us to begin accelerating the development and commercialization of evidence-based applications. But there are challenges, as you recognize. Just this morning, I noticed I was on a panel where someone from industry said that one of the things that we need to increase the development of evidence-based technologies in mHealth and other types of informatics is we need more standards and more interoperability around the data, around the systems that can help support these applications. Well, someone else said, well, we don't want too much regulation either. We need freedom to innovate, and we don't want to stifle that. So that sort of creative tension between innovation and regulation is important, and it's something we need to address and be aware of as we move forward. Another challenge that was raised in another excellent panel yesterday. Bonnie Spring was in the opening research panel, which Bill Riley right up here helped moderate. And she talked about, she had a great slide. It said, what do we mean by evidence? So when I say evidence as a behavioral scientist, I have a different definition than what someone who's a venture capitalist would. They might be looking at return on investment. I'm looking at efficacy. I'm looking at behavior change and health outcomes. An engineer or a developer might be looking at usability or functionality. And so I think we need to also recognize the assumptions behind our words when we say, well, we need more evidence for these technology, health-related applications. And finally, I think on our end as a funder and really one of the leaders in research related to cancer and our partners at NIH, we also need to start looking at new research designs and methods that are more iterative, that are really able to react and adapt to the rapid pace of change in technology so that we can better evaluate the impact of these applications for health and behavior. So these are just a few of the issues, and I'm not going to talk too long, but I did want to use them to set up my panelists here, and I'm very happy to introduce, in order of speakers, we have Gary Bennett here from Duke, we have Barbara Rapchak here from Med Online, we have Patty Weber here, my colleague from the National Cancer Institute Small Business Innovation Research Center. We also have Chris Bergstrom, who's here from WellDoc. And then finally, last but not least, we have Ann DeGeest here from MedStars and Health Tech Capital. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our first speaker, Gary Bennett, and then we're going to hopefully have time at the end for your questions and discussion.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. I'm really pleased to talk about this issue of translation from the perspective, from the academic perspective. You know, my interest in translation really started like most good business stories over dinner. I was having dinner with a couple of colleagues in Boston, actually having sushi, and we happened to have a friend of a friend who just happened to be a venture capitalist. And over dinner, you know, my colleagues and I, we talked about this issue of how do we get it out there. We struggled with this issue. How do you get it out there? A conversation I know a lot of us have had. And my VC colleague from across the table says, well, how long do you think it would take for you to turn one of your electronic interventions, one of your research-tested interventions, into a commercial product? And I thought, well, goodness, you know, 6 months to write a grant, 9 months for the first submission. You don't get it, 3 more months, 9 months for the second submission, 6 months of formative work, and then you have something. But if you're going to pay for it, I'll say 1 month. 1 month. So that's what we said. Several months later, we were a company, and we started commercializing evidence-based interventions to the disease management industry, and then several months after that, we were acquired by Health Dialogue. And I took a sabbatical at the time and worked at Health Dialogue for a period of time and had the opportunity to see the issue of translation from the industry perspective. After coming back from a sabbatical, I'm back in my research lab, and we've been since working to commercialize IOTA, which is our interactive obesity treatment approach. It's a weight loss approach that we've tested in several randomized controlled trials here and abroad. And so I've had the opportunity to see this from both sides and thought I would present just 4 or 5 observations that I think are important to consider from the academic perspective. And as Abdul said to start with, I think this issue of evidence is one that's been floating around the summit for the last couple of days. I think it's really important that we struggle with the context of evidence and what evidence counts for whom on what day of the week. As academics, we most often are talking about clinical outcomes, and I can tell you that that doesn't always dovetail particularly well with that of our industry colleagues. I challenge all of our academic colleagues to use what I think is a very sophisticated business analytic tool, and that is the Mad Lib. Some of you probably remember Mad Libs from the time in the back of the car and long trips with your family. And I would say if you're an academic and you're developing an intervention, I would challenge you to try to fit your app into this Mad Lib. So, you know, my app is called IOTA. It does weight loss. And unlike all the folks downstairs in the exhibition hall, my app, well, and I think if you're like most academics, you would say my app has evidence. Unlike most of what happens in industry, my app actually has some evidence. I think this is a very pithy way of thinking about what you have. The problem, of course, is that at least with respect to the consumer market, we have a consumer market that doesn't really privilege evidence. There are lots of ways of arguing this, but you could just look at the example of the iPhone and iOS devices. We've sold a lot of iPhones in this country. There are a lot of apps on the app stores. A lot of our kids have iPhones in their pockets, and yet we have just a handful of randomized controlled trials that detail the clinical efficacy of iOS apps. This is a major challenge. It reflects our limitations of traditional NIH funding. It reflects the differences in the speed of the respective markets. But I think it also reflects what is a really central challenge for us as academics, and that is I think we need to be a little bit more savvy at thinking about the kinds of markets to which we intend to translate our work. This is probably old hat for the industry folks in the room, but for academics, we don't generally think about the markets that we're going to be ultimately targeting. We think we're going to develop a weight loss app, or we're going to develop an app for cancer survivors. And I think we need to more frequently consider a couple of important questions, and that is, to whom does this matter? Who's going to pay for this? Does anybody other than me care? If you're going to be a translational scientist, I think those are really important considerations. I think the other challenge for us as academics is that we traditionally have been thinking about marketing directly to consumers, or we've been thinking about marketing directly to the health system. And fortunately, this is very busy, but I hope you get the point. The mHealth market is now comprised of lots of different potential adopters, all of whom have their own particular considerations for adoption, and all of whom care about evidence in slightly different ways. And it's probably not sufficient for us to only be thinking about clinical outcomes as the kind of evidence that really matters to us. I can tell you that from the perspective my industry had on, if I was working with an employer client, they often considered a very different mix of evidence as relevant compared to when I was working with a health plan. And on the industry side, we always thought of clinical outcomes as important, but they weren't always the only outcome. And I don't think many of our research colleagues think about including these outcomes in our trials, but it would aid the translational process greatly, I think, if we were to include some of these. And many of these are rather trivial to include in a traditional research trial. So I think it's incumbent upon us to be really thinking about the markets to which we intend to translate at the outset, and be thinking about the outcomes that are relevant in that setting and embedding them within our trials. That, for me, has sort of raised this kind of question of whether or not it really best serves us as academics to be trying to develop apps that we intend to translate directly into the market. And I'm not always sure that that's exactly where we're best positioned. Many of us know the dollars, NIH funding is not all that plentiful right now, and it's incumbent upon us to be thinking about diversifying our funding sources. I'm not even sure that in a traditional grant mechanism we have a sufficient amount of money to develop an industry-grade app. And I think this is a real challenge for us. I mean, this is reflected in a whole host of ways. I could just ask you, which of these two do you think is the research-designed app? I think our designs often suffer because we don't have the funds to hire the folks with the requisite expertise to do the kinds of designs. But we also have these kind of fundamental challenges of ideology. You know, as a behavioral scientist, I'm used to thinking that function outperforms form. And I think that made a lot of sense in a health communication world where we're mostly talking about paper. Online and in an mHealth context, I think form matters. And we find that very slight manipulations in the presentation of different content on a lot of our devices can change user behavior pretty dramatically. But we're also in this this is also sort of a design issue, and it's a challenge to us to think about how we design our trials. We're now in a kind of a market that doesn't ever really stop developing. If you sort of are in industry and you're developing an app, you're continuously developing. You may launch, and 9 months later you may have launched 6, 7, 8 versions, and you're testing along the way. You're talking to your users. You're thinking. You're trying to get their feedback. You're trying to determine how to optimize a presentation of certain information to cause folks to hit the button that you want them to hit, and you're developing accordingly. When I do a randomized controlled trial of an app, which we do, we develop, we launch version 1, and we test it, and then maybe 4 years later I can give you a result. And if you're still using that device, maybe you can use my app. But I can tell you that many of the folks in the audience, friends in the audience I know, have had the experience of developing something, and 4 years later, no one even has the device that we tested this thing on. But of course, the other problem is that after those 4 years, I'm not convinced that our version 1 is really something we want to disseminate necessarily, or even commercialize. It's not the kind of thing that incorporates the kind of feedback from our users that we would want to have to make this as effective as it can be. This is a challenge of research designs, and I think we have the solutions in our design toolbox to struggle with these kinds of things. But as translational scientists, I think we need to do that more often. That said, let me end on kind of a happy note, and that is that opportunities, nevertheless, they abound. I think, and one of the things that we're doing with IOTA now is that we are intentionally not releasing IOTA as an app. I don't think that we have the funds at present, unless someone around here wants to help us out with that. We don't really have the funds to do that in the kind of way that I think will be most useful for our users. Instead, we are releasing it as an API. And for those of you who don't know, an API is sort of like releasing the secret sauce so that developers can be good developers, and developers who are interested in building an evidence-based weight loss program can make use of our API, which will include an evidence-based weight loss intervention. They can design it in whatever way they think is useful. And I think that's a strategy that we might want to more frequently consider. I'm not sure that it serves us to be thinking about these design considerations. Often what we're really good at is leveraging theory and evidence in such a way that kind of optimizes outcomes. And if we can figure out what that special sauce is, I think we should be able to package that and disseminate that, as opposed to focusing on things for which I'm not sure we're best positioned. I think another opportunity that we haven't really seen leveraged quite as frequently as I'd like to in the published literature is taking advantage of lots of the consumer ecosystems. You know, many of these consumer apps and services really don't have much of a health presence, health intervention presence at present. And nevertheless, these are much less expensive to develop. Kinds of things where the design considerations are much less severe, and where I think we could really do some very interesting work at using these as platforms to disseminate existing evidence-based interventions. And then you have a host of what I think of as the new ecosystems, the EHRs, the PHRs, the patient portals, the HRAs, the kinds of systems that are designed to be extensible from the ground up, which also can be done, if not as expensively, sometimes less expensively, but also don't have the kinds of design considerations that constrain us in the app space. And let me just end for my academic research colleagues in the room by just saying that tech transfer, you know, if I talked about this about 18 months ago, all of these things require, you know, money and require funding, and it's important for us to be thinking about disseminating by diversifying our funding sources. 18 months ago, I'm not sure I would say I would have been a proponent of tech transfer, but even in the last 18 months, I've seen a lot of activity at even universities that have not been particularly progressive on this issue. Lots of us know that in the old days, if you happen to be a surgeon and you figured out that a hook should be bent to the left by 45 degrees. You could get that through tech transfer and licensed very, very quickly. But if you wanted to develop a service, develop an app that has a back end, there are a lot of challenges. Universities in particular are not very well positioned to do this kind of work. I think that's changing very rapidly, and I've been involved in several deals in the last 6 months. All of these are real-life cases. I'm happy to talk about any of these in more detail, in which universities have considered joint ventures with existing industry players. Universities have made investments. You know, philanthropic support, which is really angel support, has been dedicated. And I'm seeing lots more inter-tech transfer office interaction. And so I think we're in a new day in this space as well. I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer period. So I will stop there and invite any questions that you might have. Thank you. At the end.
Thanks, Gary. You know, one thing that I would want to explain is our reasoning behind the people that we invited to this panel. And so to really give you a diverse perspective, Gary, as you've just seen, has provided that academic research scientist perspective for a behavioral scientist doing work in mHealth with different informatics platforms and technologies. Following up, we now have Barbara. Barbara Rabchak is one of our former Small Business Innovation Research Program grantees, and she's going to present her experience as a small developer and her experience in commercializing an application with the assistance of SBIR. Following Barbara, so you don't have to have me jumping back and forth between each speaker, we're going to have Patty Weber, who is representing SBIR, and she'll give you a little more information on a funding announcement that NCI released in the summer for commercializing evidence-based technologies. And then we have Chris from WellDoc, and Chris is going to talk about an established platform in the commercial space for conducting and research as well as evidence that they build up for doing digital health services and clinical health services. And then finally, we have Anne, who represents both the angel and the venture capitalist investor perspectives, and she's going to provide another unique insight into how we can support the development of such applications.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to kind of walk you through our path to commercialization through the SBIR program, and the product that we have been working on and commercializing is a mobile medication adherence platform. And so many of you entrepreneurs out there are familiar with this advice, and most of you have heard it before. It's think big, start small, and scale fast. And so I'm going to walk you through that process and let you know where it worked for us and where it kind of hit the fan. So in terms of thinking big, we started to look at the issues around medication adherence as a result of some work that I was doing under a grant for the National Institute on Aging to try to map assets in the community to social need. And I discovered that the elderly really had a problem managing their medications. They wanted to age in place, stay in their homes, be active in the community, but they kept ending up in nursing homes and hospitals because they screwed up their meds. And so we thought that there might be a way that we could solve this using some interesting existing and emerging technologies. But first, we looked at the numbers behind it, and they were pretty astonishing. It turned out that half of the patients take their medicines as prescribed only half of the time. And the result was 3 times as many doctor visits and almost $16,000, $17,000 per patient per year in additional medical costs. And the net to the U.S. healthcare system was around $250 billion. So some big numbers, some potentially big market drivers, and it seems to suggest that we had a big problem. And so our approach in starting small was to see if we could integrate, at the time there were no smartphones, there were cell phones and PDAs, and there was RFID, and we thought we could marry some of these technologies and create this patient-facing mobile interface that kind of turns your phone into a medication sensor and would help you identify the right med at the right time and push educational material around the medication and your disease. And that data would flow from the patient-facing interface on the phone to a clinical interface at the back end, where we had web services and the clinicians could design really complicated regimens and do things like anchor them to your lifestyle event, and these things would work together to drive adherence and result in positive behavior change and keep people out of the hospital. And the big opportunity that we saw was in the data mining and data aggregation. We see data as a potential currency in the future. So that was our thinking. That was our big idea around what we saw as a big problem. And so this is the way it played out for us as we've been working on this over the past 6 or 7 years. So we started with the idea and then socializing the concept, protecting the IP. We patented the concept. We socialized it, wrote a proposal in response to a contract solicitation from the National Cancer Institute, carving out what we saw as a big problem in chronic disease and maybe seeing if we could define a niche in cancer, in oncology, or specialty pharmacy and clinical trials. And we were awarded the phase 1 contract, and so that led us into the discovery phase, where we were able to prove the concept in a phase 1 feasibility study. We started with an ethnographic approach. We're always very patient-centric in what we do, so we spent a lot of time talking to patients and trying to understand what the life of a cancer patient really is like, or a clinical trial patient. And we also looked at what the workflow was for on the clinical side. So we did focus groups with pharmacists and providers, and that helped us develop a prototype to do a small phase 1 feasibility study among prostate cancer patients. That turned out to be quite successful. We were able to demonstrate that we could get data flowing back and forth, and we could identify drugs, and patients could actually use it, and they said they liked it. So that resulted in a phase 2 contract, SBIR contract, and that enabled us to now take the prototype and test and refine it. And this is where there's a corollary to the scale fast recommendation, and that's fail fast. So you kind of are in the fail fast phase of your product development here, where you keep talking to the patients, you test and refine, it's iterative, and finally you get it to a place where you're ready to do some clinical studies in the real world, you know, the dirty, messy kind of real studies where you're putting devices in the hands of patients and they go home with them, and you know, you pray for the best. So that first clinical study, or the real clinical study, it was an IRB-approved randomized controlled clinical study in a larger population. And once again, we were able to reproduce the adherence data and the behavior change data changes that we had seen in the small feasibility study. So we're at the stage where we are now needing to validate the business model and validate the market. So we were able to secure some industry trials. We got industry potential strategic partners to sponsor some trials for us. We validated it further. We identified some channels to the market, and we started to look at what the business model really would be. Did what we think the business model would be actually play out to be the correct business model with which we should go to market? And we used an advisory board to help guide us in some of these decisions. And then now you're at the stage where you have to create traction and build consensus around this. So we wrote an investor pitch. We started to identify and handpick some potential strategic partners. And in parallel with that effort, we wrote a applied for a fast-track SBIR grant that would enable us to change our business model a little bit and deliver the technology and intervention as in a SaaS model, so software as a service model. And we were fortunate to be awarded the fast-track grant, and now in the scaling stage, if you will, we have been able to leverage that grant to get matching funds of $1 million from a strategic partner, and that's going to enable us to do some interesting things with the existing platform that we have. So the piece that really fell apart for us is the scaling fast. That was a long timeline. I went through it in a couple of minutes here, but believe me, I think it was, someone said to me yesterday, mobile health is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and that's really, really the truth. It's good in theory, but it's really difficult to execute in practice. And a number of factors play into that. The first is just the realities of the SBIR timeline. Gary alluded to those a moment ago. It's a long journey from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 3. We're all in a high-risk market with unproven business models, and those business models, the ROI, the return on your investment for mobile technologies, those take a long time to validate on the financial side, and they're costly to run. And to get traction in the market, the kind that investors want to see, you really do need to do extensive validation and testing and through clinical trials, and that just takes a long time. So it's a long timeline. There's a high cost to get there, and so the scale fast really has been a challenge for us. This is just 4 years of some of the evidence behind the technology that we've developed. So various trials, some funded by NIH, some funded by industry. We did usability testing. It was a requirement for the SBIR contract that we'd have independent usability testing done at the informatics lab in Bethesda, and that was actually very beneficial because now we know, from the patient-centric ethnographic approach, you want something that's going to fit into the patient's lifestyle, or you won't get the adoption that you think you're going to get. So it was, another positive piece of evidence that we were able to acquire. So just to wrap up our current status, we were fortunate to get another SBIR grant for about $1 million. It's a fast track, so it shortens our timeline. We use that to leverage matching funds of another $1 million from a strategic partner, and that's going to enable us to extend the platform to all the major mobile operating systems, move to a SaaS business model. More importantly, too, we're going to be able to leverage some of their intellectual property and technologies in medical interfaces, and that's going to enable us to create a coded adherence document that will flow into the EMR using clinical data architecture. So we'll be fully integrated with the longitudinal care record. We'll be able to help EMR vendors and providers demonstrate meaningful use. And then finally, we'll be doing yet another clinical study. It's part of our requirement under the grant. And then the go-to-market strategy is to leverage the distribution channels of our partner. So I think that's all for me, and I think I have 13 seconds, so thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Patty Weber. I'm a program director at the National Cancer Institute's SBIR Development Center. Do I need to? There we go. So the SBIR Development Center at NCI, we focus entirely on small businesses. And so what I'm going to talk about today, besides just a little bit about the program, I'll talk about a new funding opportunity we have in the digital health space. So for those of you who aren't aware of the program, the SBIR program is congressionally mandated, and it's been reauthorized through 2017. So SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer. So currently, any federal agency with a budget over $100 million has to have SBIR and STTR programs. So NIH is one of those agencies. So currently at the NCI, that represents $115 million annually with the current set-aside of 2.7%. and that's $690 million at the NIH. So what are some of the reasons to seek this funding? First of all, it's one of the largest sources of early-stage capital available, and it's a stable and predictable source of funding. The intellectual property rights are retained by the small business. The government does not have any rights to the IP that's funded and developed under these grants and contracts. This funding is not a loan. There's no repayment required. The funding is non-dilutive, so there's no dilution of your business with this funding. And what we think is important at NCI, and I'm sure my colleagues in other institutes at NIH agree, that many of our applicants, as Barbara mentioned, have been able to use their SBIR funding to leverage getting funding from other third-party sources. And I think that's why I wanted to follow Barbara's presentation, because I think she's a great example of what you can do if you've received SBIR funding. And we think part of this is that the investors and other third parties appreciate the fact that these applications do go through rigorous peer review at the NIH. So as I mentioned, the current set-aside is 2.7% and for the SBIR program and 0.35% for the STTR. And these set-asides are going to be going up incrementally through 2017. So that big pot of money is going to be growing. And there are some other changes to the law with the reauthorization that will be described further in January when our new omnibus solicitation is published. So I won't go into too much detail because we really haven't received the policy guidance from the Small Business Administration yet. So this is the funding opportunity that I really wanted to highlight today because it relates to health IT and digital health. So this, the goal of this program announcement is for small businesses to partner with large businesses, because we've seen over the years that we've funded a lot of great tools, behavioral interventions, tools to improve patient-provider communication, but the problem that our companies have had is disseminating these products. And so we feel that it's important if they can partner early with a strategic partner, a large business that has a large footprint that can help get that tool out there to be used by more people and have a greater impact on public health. So because NCI is the only institute at the NIH that's currently signed on to this program announcement, the tool does have to have a cancer focus. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be a platform technology that could easily be applied to diabetes just as well as cancer or any other chronic disease. So these are some of the areas we're interested in as any tool to prevent or reduce the risk of cancer, any tool to improve patient-provider communication. To be eligible for this, you could have had a phase 1 proposal funded by another institute at the NIH and then come to the NCI for the phase 2. Or we're requiring a fast track. So if you don't already have a phase 1 funded, then you need to submit a fast track. And I think Barbara made it kind of fairly clear how fast tracks work, but in the case of a fast track, you apply for a phase 1 and a phase 2 together. So phase 1 represents at least $150,000 for a 6-month to 1-year project. And phase 2 is $1 million to $1.5 million for a 2-year project. So it's a significant amount of funding that will allow you to hopefully develop your prototype in phase 1 and then go on to finalize the product that you're going to do randomized trials or whatever evidence-based studies you can do in that 2-year phase 2. And we have, the next receipt date's tomorrow, so I don't expect if anyone hasn't started that you meet that. But it's just we accept applications on the standard SBIR receipt dates, which are April 5th, August 5th, and December 5th. So we just had the first set of applications came in August 5th. So this is a very new funding announcement. It'll be available for 3 years. We're hoping we can get some of the other NIH institutes to sign on to this, but for now it is just NCI. And I'm happy to talk with any of you who have more questions about the SBIR program. I didn't want to spend too much time on all the details of the program, but you can go to our website at sbir.cancer.gov. All of our contact information is there. My email address is there, my phone number. I'm happy to speak with any of you if you're interested in applying to this particular program announcement for Health IT or the Omnibus solicitation, which is the one that's investigator initiated. You wouldn't be required to have a large business partner. But we're there to help you out and answer any questions that you might have. If you're interested in funding, any funding opportunities throughout the NIH, you can go to this website. And my colleagues at the other institutes are also, as program directors, we're here to help new applicants. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Bergstrom, Chief Strategy and Commercial Officer at WellDoc. I'm just going to walk you through kind of our journey to share that experience with you. WellDoc is a healthcare company focused on engaging patients and enhancing outcomes. And the way that we choose to do that is by changing patient behavior and helping clinicians make the best decisions possible. And we work across a variety of technology devices, of course including mobile, to make that happen. At the heart of WellDoc is our expert analytics system. This is a clinical and behavioral algorithm embedded in a software system that provides automated patient coaching, so real-time feedback. Here's what you should do to better manage your symptoms, your medication, your biometrics, your lifestyle, those moment-to-moment decisions that patients make every day to manage a disease. And for the clinician, clinical decision support, to simply say, here's where your patient was last time you saw them, here's where they are today, here's what's changed. Now, according to evidence-based guidelines and standards of care, not according to things we made up, here's what you should consider doing about it. And then it's up to the doctor to actually decide. We just want to offload that analysis and put it at their fingertips and really bring the intelligence and simplicity of a computer into the physician's office. And for the patients, we believe in fitting into their life wherever and however they work. So we work on the majority of cell phones, smartphones, feature phones, hundreds of handsets, on the majority of web and PC-based platforms. We're embedding into other medical devices. We're working with automobile companies to work in the automobile because your health doesn't leave you when you step into the car. And for the physician, same thing. We want to fit into their workflow. So if they want to get it via fax, which most of them do today, we'll send them a fax. If they want to go to a web portal, they can go to a web portal. If they want to integrate, if they want to get it through their EMR directly, as George Washington University presented this morning, we've integrated with Allscripts, and it allows for that real-time continuity of care directly through the medical record and make a med change there, and the patient coaching algorithms are updated in real time. What's interesting in mobile health, not all products are the same, which is fantastic. We need a lot of variety of different products doing different things for different reasons and at different levels. And now there's, I don't know, there's probably 30,000 health apps because I probably wrote this a month ago. And they're not all the same. Very, very few of them are actually FDA cleared, which means very, very few of them are diagnosing, treating, or mitigating a disease because you need FDA clearance to do that. And even fewer of those, as was mentioned by Gary, actually have published clinical data behind them. And even fewer of those require a prescription and the medical oversight of a physician to say, this is medically necessary for this patient. And those are mobile medical therapies. And I think they're really going to be a game changer. And one of the first mobile medical therapy is from WellDoc, and it's a Class 2, FDA-cleared, prescription-only product for patients with type 2 diabetes and their healthcare providers, provides the coaching and decision support that we talked about. And it's delivered and prescribed just like any other prescription product out there. The doctor has to learn about it and understand who it would be good for and why they would want to use it, and then they prescribe it for the patient. And then we actually sit down and train that patient and make sure it works on their BlackBerry and on their MacBook and whatever other devices they might want to use. And if they have any questions after that, they give us a call and we troubleshoot or help them out. And no doctor is going to prescribe a product if they don't believe it actually is going to be good medicine and move the needle. And no payer will pay for a product if they don't believe it's actually improving health either. I mean, this is the way the majority of healthcare products have been for the last few decades. And I would put forth, I don't really see that changing. I think there's lots of groups that should look at ways to evolve different strategies, but this has been how healthcare's operated for decades, and I think it largely will continue to be, at least for the next few years. And so at WellDoc, we invested upstream of our product launches significant time, significant dollars into developing the evidence and conducting 2 RCTs and getting them published in world-class diabetes journals, demonstrating that we actually move the needle on outcomes, and showing actually that we do what we say. We actually change both patient behavior and physician behavior. They're twice as likely to make a medication change, get the patient to the right therapy further, farther, faster, and titrate them appropriately when they use our decision support. And then we moved on from trials into real-world demonstration programs and actually showed that we could reduce hospital and ER admissions. And then for context, for those of you that are not familiar with diabetes, the 2-point A1C reductions that we found, this is a list of the top-selling blockbuster billion-dollar diabetes drugs. Each of them does multiple billions of dollars. On average, they reduce A1C by a point, or about half a point compared to placebo. We're able to nearly double that, and it's because patients need an intervention that's not pharmacologic. They need the pharmacologics too, but we're able to do things that they can't do. We can manage their symptoms and their biometrics and their lifestyle. And we can even help them, as Barbara was talking about, better manage their medications. And it's that treating a patient holistically that's really been missing, especially in chronic care. But to do all that I described, that's a long journey, so I stole your arrow. Sorry about that. But you know, this is what we do at WellDoc. We walk through developing a product and figuring out the business model and the strategy way upstream, and going through regulatory clearance and conducting the clinical trials, getting the evidence published, and then scaling up and getting ready for a proper launch. Each of those is easily multiple years and many millions of dollars. Fortunately, it doesn't have to be linear. You can overlap them and consolidate the time frame. But if you were to just drill down on the first bullet point, you can see just developing the product. If you want to have an FDA-cleared product, you've got to follow an FDA quality product development process. It's actually fairly regimented and a lot of documentation. It requires quality systems and investment in it. And it's probably going to be at least a couple years and a lot of money to go through that process. And we at WellDoc, we went through that on our own. It was painful, but we felt it was the right thing to do in diabetes. And then we thought, going forward, and we have a platform that it can work with any disease, maybe there's someone else that could help us go through that journey on other diseases. And we thought, wonder who that is. Well, there's one industry that's very experienced and understands the value of investing ahead of a product launch to get the clinical evidence, to get regulatory clearance, and they're really looking to go beyond the pill, and that's the pharma industry. So we found a really nice marriage here where we can work with pharma companies and help them go beyond the pill, which is where their strategic intent is, and they can help us go through that long and expensive journey. You know, if you look at it from their perspective, they're used to a 10-year process and $1 billion. So when we say it's only a couple of years and tens of millions of dollars, it sounds like something very easy. So it's probably the opposite of what the guys at Angry Birds would be thinking. So we sit down with them and we identify a therapeutic area that's important to them that we think our platform would be very applicable to. And then we go through that process and get ready to launch the product. And I'll just conclude, what's neat about mobile health is that we can actually drive value in a much broader way than some of the traditional healthcare products. And that's why it's necessary. We have to do this. We don't have a choice as a society. We've got to be able to address more than just one intervention pathway with a patient. And we need to drive costs, quality, engagement, satisfaction. Wow, can you imagine that we actually bring satisfaction for a patient into healthcare, and of course outcomes. And you know, I define mobile health as empowering patients and empowering doctors. It doesn't matter what device it is. You don't even need a device sometimes. It's simply about bringing healthcare to you and empowering you to do what you're actually inherently capable of doing if you have just a little bit of help. So thank you for having me.
Oops. So I'm last but not least. Thank you for stealing my line earlier. How many of you are entrepreneurs? Okay. How many of you need money? Okay. Who didn't raise their hand? No, so just kidding. So how many of you think you have all the data you need to raise money? Okay, perfect. I got my audience. So let me give a different perspective. We have some great speakers. I'm going to have a totally different twist from an investor perspective. So at first I'm going to define the word health tech, and on purpose I don't use mobile health, because mobile means you're using mobility as an end of itself. We're looking at health tech as a way to solve a solution in healthcare, where mobility is one of the way that's an enabler. And so really the end point is, do you decrease costs? We have an ROI, and is somebody willing to pay for it? So I think I just kind of get you my mindset here. So what do we need for evidence? Well, what does evidence mean? Well, I'm going to just for the fun of it tell you when we look at companies, and I'm going to explain what my group does. It's called Health Tech Capital. We have probably looked at 500 deals in the last 2 years. The first thing we do is to say, okay, let's assume it works. Now remember, they just spend all this time telling you that that's what they're focusing on. So I'm saying, I give you the benefit of the doubt. It works. So, well, how big is the market? What's the problem you're solving? Is there value? Can you measure it? What do you have to do to convince these people they're willing to pay for it? And is there a lot of those people willing to pay for it? Now, if you can convince me of that, then I go back to say, well, okay, what do I have to do to find out if it really works? And I'm just kind of giving this as a mindset because a lot of entrepreneurs really focus on proving that the technology works. And it's like, you know, researcher, my husband is a PhD, you can go on that curve forever. So be very careful. So I'm going to give you a different definition of evidence. You know, what exactly is the problem you're solving? Not the technology, what's the problem? And who does it matter to? And there may be multiple stakeholders. A physician has different endpoint that a nurse has, or the patient, or the caregiver. And what's the ultimate value? Is it ease of use? Is it getting rid of hassle, saving time to the nurse, you know, decreasing the length of stay, decreasing readmission? I mean, really finding out what is the true metrics. And at times there's not one, there's multiple ones. And then it turns out the burden of evidence is very different if you're selling to a consumer. How many people are using Zeos? Oh, my group here, nobody. So Zeos, you know, this is the device you put on your forehead that gives you some indication of sleep. Is there any evidence-based data showing you it improves your sleep? I don't think so. But some consumer paid for it. Then I go to the extreme side, on the payer side, where we have a lot of entrepreneurs coming to us to say, well, this is easy. We just go to Aetna and United, and we charge them $20 per member per month, and then we all roll on the floor and we say, okay, tell us more. And those people say, fine, give me longitudinal data on thousands of patients with a placebo-control group, and say, fine, come back when you have it. And for some of the issues I'm going to bring up here. So really define who you are. And then for more perception is that when we're looking at investing in a company, we really spend initially most of the time to say, is this big enough? Is it worth the risk we're going to be taking on the technology side? And I'm just saying this to flip your mindset. So who will pay? How you acquire them? How do you retain them? A lot of people say, well, we give it away and we'll make money later. That makes us very nervous. And so what's the ROI? Do you know if there's a market? Because some cases there is no data, but there's at least some roadmap on how to get there. So at times it feels like we're jumping there, you know, and it's us jumping, and hope that somebody catches on the other side. So just see our mindset is very different. So it turns out there's a funding gap, and the funding gap is getting worse. And typically what happens, as you have seen from the panelists, is that we have the government is doing some amazing work in funding some of these early ideas and giving some SBIR grants or some grant, you know, from Todd Parry's group. And then they come to us and they say, well, we have these great claims. And some of them may be even diagnostic claims, which makes us even more nervous because now you have the FDA burden of proof, which is extremely high. I should have put on top there. And people say, fine, show me the data and we'll wait, come back. And that's the problem. How do you fund this data? So you have to prioritize what is the data you really need to get the funding, not to go to market. You have to do it by steps. So who is doing some of the financing? A lot of the nonprofit foundations are really helping. So you have the Moore Foundation, the Grove Foundation, the California Healthcare Foundation are really active, each one in their parameter of interest, in really giving grants to really help validate your prototype. Large healthcare delivery group are stepping in because of the funding gap. So you have people like Dignity Health who will use their organization to validate some of your alpha and beta prototype. I had a conference called the Health Tech Conference a month ago. One of my speakers was Amir Rubin from Stanford. He said when he does a free trial, free as defined by the entrepreneur because they give it for free, he says it cost me $300,000. And so, yes, they can do a few of those per year, but, you know, how many companies are on the floor here? And so we are going to have to be creative on how do we finance these trials with the providers from the provider perspective. Forget about you getting any revenues. So, and then there's a lot of corporate ventures and corporate partners are coming into the space, validating it. AT&T and Sprint and Verizon, a lot of them have been generous in-kind contribution, depending what your business model is. You have to be creative, is what I'm trying to say. What is the problem? Why isn't there more people rushing into this space? If you notice, there was a panel I was attending yesterday. They asked how many people were investors, and I think there were 13 out of 400 or something like that. So here's the challenge. Life science venture capitalists have been trained to do medical device and biotech. They have MD, PhD in their staff who are absolutely brilliant as far as understanding the mechanism of action, physiological risk, and figure out how the physician is going to use a product. They spend 10 years, with every time there's a little downside there, to basically put money in a very controlled manner with very clear milestones. Every time you miss your milestone, there's a chance of what's called a down round, which is bad news for everybody. As a result of that, the last thing they're going to do after 10 years and $20 to $100 million, depending on the product they're developing, you finally go to markets to create a new market. They don't do that. So let's look at the tech VC. So the tech VC, it's exactly the opposite. They have no idea the next Groupon and Facebook is going to come. And so what they do spray and pray, and then they see which ones survive. Here's the problem. We are a different animal. We are the blue line. It probably takes a few $1 million to validate your idea. And then when you get the inflection point, you escalate. So there's a very high market risk. How do we define market risk? Will they use it? And the more you're going towards the consumption, the higher is the risk. We have no roadmap on how to do that. You can sell to a hospital. It's painful, but it can be done. And who's going to pay for it? And in healthcare, it's not the same person that's using it. So what do we know for each of these markets? It depends what you're doing. It turns out that if you're selling a device to the hospital setting for care communication, for example, that's probably the risk, but it's the scariest one if you come from outside the healthcare world because it's complicated and not rational. If, on the other hand, you sell a product direct to the consumer to be sold to the physicians there, and you give it away and you help to monetize it later, that's probably okay for the adoption. The revenue model probably needs to be figured out. So it depends on the bucket you're in. So the evidence you need is going to be different depending on the type of risk we perceive. If you're doing the home healthcare monitoring, well, what type of patients do you have? Do you have a diabetic patient that needs to be embedded into the healthcare system, or is it a 22-year-old who just wants to be a marathon runner? Very, very different milestones. So what is difference in evidence? Well, what is unique about what you're doing? Are you using a proven approach and trying to deliver it via mobility, or are you doing something that's absolutely new? What is unique that you have to prove? So I'm going to kind of look at 4 companies. AmeriHealth, anybody knows AmeriHealth? This is pre-diabetes. So there was a YMCA did a program with United Health where they showed that if you do like an Alcoholics Anonymous, it's a 16-week program, it's weekly visits, in-person support group, you could decrease the weight by 7%. And then as a result of that, you avoid these people to convert into diabetes. So their value proposition is to do a virtual coach with a real person but using technology over the web. So their endpoints is to do a clinical trials that shows they're as good as the other method that was more labor intensive. Different burden. A company called Care and Sync. Care and Sync is for team care collaboration, and 66% of the medical errors in hospitals are due to communication failures. It turns out this Project Red and Project Boost, which is a very labor-intensive training program to help people do some of this workflow more effectively. The company is making this into a technology-enabled services. So what they have to do in their data is that they have to show that they are as good as the labor-intensive one. These 2 companies had one thing in common. There was no VC coming in. And so what happens is that we had to be creative. So we anchored around. And for every dollar we put in there, we were able to get $10 of our monies. nonprofit foundation as venture debt with some Warren kickers. We get several strategic investing. People I've never talked to before in the last 30 years of my life. You have to be creative because the traditional VCs are not moving in. They're waiting for the data. And I have 1 second. Hold on. So new approach, Asthmapolis. A lot of you may know Asthmapolis. They are into the new approach. They have to really prove the whole concept works. Lots of evidence. VCs have been waiting on the sideline to say, show me the money. They have done a fantastic job in really working with the California Healthcare Foundation and Dignity Health in really collecting the data that is needed to get the VC to step in action there. And Wellness Effects is a kind of a different company we also invested in. They got angels earlier, and what they use is the existing biomarkers that's available for the Quest or LabCorp, but they're pushing it directly to the consumer there with a telehealth consult with it. And so they're doing it at a price of $199, which you and I could not do as a copay, for example. So they have to prove user adoption and market size. So we create this collaborative ecosystem because you don't need money. You need mentoring, smart money, validation by a strategic partner, and then you need to get the partners who are really helping you opening these doors. So we created this group called Health Tech Capital, which is an ecosystem. 25% of our members are physicians, so we have deep expertise in healthcare. We have relationship with the top venture capitalists playing in the field, and as you can see, we're building up our industry members because we think we can open channels of distribution, marketing expertise, and bringing them much earlier than they've ever been to. And I went really fast, sorry about that. So you need 3 expertise, not just tech.
Okay, thank you. That was really a lot of information over the last few minutes. And I think that just to recap before we move into discussion and questions, I think that it was really fascinating for me, and I hope for you, to look at the various perspectives presented. We have a small business that was supported by innovation and commercialization funds from the government. We also have a research and academic perspective on how to translate the evidence and data and methods that are being used in research into actual practice for mHealth and other technologies in digital health. We had an established a clinical decision support platform system, and we learned how they were able to leverage and really try to address some of the hurdles related to funding, developing, and going through the regulation approval for their product. And then finally, we got a really interesting take from the other side of the fence, the venture capital angel investor world, and really provide some insight into some of the growing interest and investment support that's really more nuanced than one might expect in digital health technologies. So with that being said, I want to open up the floor for questions. We do have 2 mics in the middle aisle here, and so I know because we're recording the proceedings, it would be great if you could address your questions into the mic. Please introduce yourself, and let's proceed.
Hi, thank you so much. That was very interesting. My name is Stacy Landau. I'm a faculty member at the University of Chicago. And I'm interested from your comments initially, but from the panel's perspective, which universities do you think are doing best in the tech transfer space, aside from the usual, MIT, Caltech sort of places, especially around health IT? And are you aware of any professional associations, organizations that are providing training to either entrepreneurs inside academe or tech transfer offices to kind of get us all up to speed in how to best work together toward commercialization of these sorts of technologies?
That's a really wonderful question. I think that the short answer is Stanford is probably the leader in this space. That's certainly one of the usual suspects. I think there's been a lot of movement. So Penn has a really excellent program. Duke has a growing program. Ohio State has a really remarkable program. So I think that some of the non-usual suspects are growing in this space. I don't know of. I'll say that what I've been surprised by of late has been the degree to which the university tech transfer departments have been talking with one another, and usually that comes at the recommendation of a given academic. So, we've heard for instance, there's a great program at Penn. Penn's made a lot of investments in small startups, and so Duke is called Penn and such. I don't know of an organization that's providing any input to academic entrepreneurs at this point. What happens for us in North Carolina is that every probably 3 or 4 weeks, I'll get an email from somebody who says, I've got this great great idea. I know you've played in that space. Would you mind meeting at the coffee shop to talk? And it's a remarkably inefficient way to share this kind of information, and yet I think that's the kind of environment that we find ourselves in. For many of us, I think, as you know, the idea of doing this kind of work is not exactly in keeping with our academic mission, and so I think for a long time it's been undercover, and I think that's changing very, very slowly.
I'd like to put a different twist. So historically in medical devices and biotech, ideas came from academic, were tested by academic in academic centers, were approved there, and then went to the general market. This is a different market. So ideas don't necessarily come from academic anymore. They're really coming from where you practice medicine, which is mostly community hospitals. And one of the interesting things that came in our health tech conference panel a month ago from successful CEOs is that the last place you want to be to do your alpha and your beta trials is in an academic center, because it's not representative of the market you're going after. Most of what you do is workflow, and way to how you change healthcare delivery there. And also you want the blessing as far as the pure, science side. The true way of developing your application there should be developed with some of the big players like Ascension Health, Kaiser, and people like that.
Any other questions?
Jonah Comstock from mHealth News. I don't have a specific person in mind for this question, but I know several people talked about the RCT and the sort of paradox of clinical trials in mobile, that by the time you get them done, they're, in some sense, they can be irrelevant, So I kind of wanted to ask, do you guys think, is the RCT, is it a necessary evil, or can that expectation be streamlined? Can that process be streamlined in face of sort of the reality of mobile health devices?
I know the person behind you can also talk a little bit about this, but I'm going to pass it to my panel first. I know we've talked about this separately in a few instances. Gary, do you want to take a first shot, or?
I think the RCT should die a very slow death, or maybe not such a slow death. We should kill it off quickly. I think that there are several competing designs that are equally effective. The notion of the RCT as a gold standard probably applies reasonably well to drug trials. I'm not so sure that that's the case in this space. A lot of people have written about this more eloquently than I could probably say it in a few minutes, but suffice it to say there are a whole handful of designs that one can use as reasonable alternatives, and yet what we're dealing with is a cultural challenge. It's a cultural challenge in the academic world. Academics are slow, period, but slow to accept change, and I think it's also a regulatory challenge. FDA has its heels dug in on this issue, and I think if we can push the change from the academic world, we may be able to push change at the regulatory level as well. But I don't think there's any question for right-thinking people that the RCT is not the only way here.
I would answer it from a couple perspectives. I think one, my job as a business person, especially in a small company, and maybe if I was Pfizer, I'd think slightly different, but I don't even think then. It's not to change the rules of the game at the macro level or to change what the gold standard for evidence is. It's my job to play within the rules of the existing ones. If the NIH or some other much larger body wants to, over time, evolve what the standards are. So that's the business perspective. Give me the rules and then we'll play with inside of them, is one thought. Secondly, I think that it's a misnomer that you go through the RCT and then by the time you're done and you're published, which can take 2, 3, even more years, that it doesn't matter anymore. I think one perspective is that can be your base level of claims, and in parallel, you can be improving the product on top of that. And when you begin your trials, you don't have to have your full commercial scalable solution. So, we did our trials when we worked on 1 or 2 devices, not when we worked on 400 devices. And so, as you are working your commercial scale up, your trials are going in parallel. So you can sequence things in a reasonably intelligent way, and then, if you want to go back and do another trial of your improved product later and develop an even higher standard of claim, then I think you could do that. And then finally, I would say that just from a time context, and I should really get a hard data slide on this because I've been thinking, I think there's misnomers that, things happen in 12 months. I mean, I've only been working for 15 years, so whatever that perspective provides, Nothing, almost every industry, I bet if we looked at 20 industries, cycle times are not a year. I mean, you think they are a year because you see a new phone model come out every year. I mean, this phone was probably 4 years minimum development at Apple, the first one, and then they can innovate on top of that every year. Auto industry, 4 years for a new car, probably 8 years for a new platform. Airline industry, 10 years for a new drug industry, 10 years. Medical device, 4 years. So I think, it's probably a misnomer to think that things happen in a year or two and that you're going to miss the boat. And I think you have to have, I'd say generally, at least a 4-year time frame in your mind for where the market's going and where you're going as a product. And then RCTs do begin to fit within a 4-year window.
From a funder's perspective at the NCI, I would say that it's been really gratifying for us to have options in terms of how we advance our science, both on the basic and the translational research side. So to give you an example, we still see a lot of value in the traditional R funding mechanisms, primarily many of them which involve RCTs, but we also see value in some of the mechanisms presented today and touched on, such as the SBIR mechanism. We've also really appreciated the Open Innovation America Competes Challenges, which has been an experiment for us at NIH, and I think it has really led us in a number of fruitful directions to embrace innovators and to see how we can tie them to the evidence, the data, and the research being done. I'm going to also cheat a little. Bill is the new branch chief of our Science of Research and Technology branch at the National Cancer Institute. And this branch, one of its missions is to focus on addressing new methods, new designs, team science for these tough challenges that some of which we've talked about in this panel. Do you have anything to add?
I was just going to ask a question. I think Gary's point is well taken. And there are newer designs we can think about. So RCTs aren't the be-all and end-all. At one end of the spectrum, there's N-of-1 trials and successive N-of-1 trials where one could sort of layer on top of it as you're iterating, and some Bayesian models in which we can actually then essentially sort of make some estimates of what the population-based sort of effect might potentially be. At the other end of the spectrum, there's some nice quasi-experimental designs that are done in community-based, hospital-based sorts of system-based changes that we could also think about using. So we're rolling out and evaluating as we're disseminating. So I think there's some other models other than just the RCT. But do I get to ask my question now?
Well, I'm just going to add a little bit. I think the nuance for us is that we don't just focus on drug designs and traditional bench science. There is a range of designs that are more appropriate for consumer and behavioral health technologies and applications that are evidence-based. And I think that's where these other designs are more relevant.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Now you can ask
Thank
your
you.
question.
So in addition to the technology sort of evolving rapidly and everyone in this space having to adjust to that, I was struck, and Chris, I'd heard you talk about it before, and Ann, you did it as well today, sort of the focus on early in the process knowing who's using it and who's going to pay for it. And we're also, the other thing that's evolving is the healthcare system. And I think one of the things that people struggle with now is, okay, I know who might use it and who would pay for it in the current healthcare system. But 5 years from now, in the hopeful new healthcare system, one that's not quite so broken, how do you think through sort of anticipating that and who's going to be paying for something 5+ years from now?
That's an excellent question, because I always feel bad for a young 20-year-old coming on the tech side into healthcare. I mean, first you have to figure the rules are irrational and they are changing. So I always says, in the Titanic, you make a left turn and you just see iceberg. So what we typically do, if somebody comes to us, which we have a few cases that says, I have this great new way of increasing the volume of fee-for-services, literally my physicians in the room pretty much walk out on the guy. And so that's we know that model will disappear. We don't know exactly where we're going to land. So if somebody comes with an intrinsic value proposition that decrease cost in a hard way, it's decreasing length of stays, it's decreasing complication, it doesn't really matter where we end up on the payment side, because it's going to be risk sharing, it's going to be capitated, it's going to be bundling, whatever you call it is going to be lower. And the risk is going to be passed from the government and third-party payers, is going to be passed down to us. And us is going to be defined in multiple ways. It could be the Accountable Care Organization, nicknamed ACO. We used to call these HMOs in the past, except now the big difference is that we have found a carrot, which is the very high deductibles, which is if you don't behave well, we're going to get you to pay. And one of the big changes that we see right now, we've done a lot of work with these self-insured employers, and self-insured employers are the big drivers in changes. 75% of the gross profit in the Fortune 500 are spent in healthcare cost. it's not sustainable. So they went out. And what they're doing is that they're giving clear, transparencies, that's the catch-light models, that's taking off. What they're also doing, which is a bit scary, is what's called relative risk, I forgot the name, relative pricing. Anybody know what relative pricing is? They do that, they look at the, let's say it's, Palo Alto, California. They look at the cost of an MRI between $1,000 to $8,000. Okay, Stanford next door is $1,500. We pay $1,500. You want to go to UCSF or another location there, it's $8,000. You pay the relative pricing difference. And this is where we're going, so that we are going to be what we have been able to do on Amazon, which is this is relative perception of value. You can always pay the higher cost if you want, but you will pay the difference. That carrot is going to change the behavior. So if the value proposition fit into where we're going, doesn't matter how you call it, and it has a way for the consumer to engage with data, and it has the providers to be willing to pay for lower costs, then you have something that's going to work. And you just need to be flexible and zig and zag, which you have to do in market risk anyway. It's a long story, but there's a way to look at it.
I like to break a business opportunity down by the channel and the customer, and they don't have to necessarily be the same, but and I will go back to my comments, nothing changes rapidly. So look at what is today, understand the vectors that things might be moving in, think about your time frame. But competitive bidding, for example, if you're not familiar with that, is kind of a change in how they're paying for DME. Something that in my industry we were fearing 11 years ago, and in some sectors it still hasn't been implemented. It's just the way things work, and it's not just healthcare. And Medicare, with their new pay-for-performance environments and ACOs and the model, you can read at least the current legislation, which can change, but they're rolling it out over 5 years, and it starts with like 2% of the doctors, and then 5%, and then 20, and then 40, and so you can actually know, well, this is how fast it theoretically is probably going to change, and then especially for a small business, almost none of that matters, because the slice of pie you need will not have changed by the time you got there. So I look at healthcare. There's 10% cash, 3% VA, 2% long-term care, 10% Medicaid, 30% Medicare, 45% commercial. Break commercial down, you've got half of that being from employers and 2% through disease management. And then you say, okay, what each channel, you have to look at the granular. If I'm playing in that channel, how fast is it going to change? Does it matter to me over what time? Just get really exact about it.
And one example of that phase change over time is meaningful use legislation in phases, and we can really see what's laid out in the roadmap, even though that is subject to tweaks and changes. We have time for one last question, then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd be interested to hear from several of the panel members how they think crowdfunding fits into the overall health tech ecosystem, not just for small companies, but also perhaps for funding research grants or other kinds of needs in the health tech area.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Pat Solver, and full disclosure, I have a healthcare crowdfunding site, Health Tech Hatch.
Thank you.
So if you look at the Wall Street Journals, like 3 or 4 days ago, the SEC retiring chair, I think, punt, and she punted exactly on that issue because it's extremely politically incorrect for multiple sources. So they were supposed to issue the guidelines by December. It clearly is not going to happen. That's data number one. Data number two, we were told as angel investors that if we invest in any company that had crowdfunding based on how the rules are set today, which could still change, we will not get the no insurance and will be personally liable for any claims the company may have made to prior investors. Now, that is pretty much the kiss of death. Because nobody's going to be personally liable for things they have zero control over. They've said the same thing to the venture capitalists. So the danger there is that if you do crowdfunding where you sell equity, I'm not talking about selling your products, you may limit your potential afterwards of raising capital as long as these SEC rules are not clarified there. I also like to differentiate it from crowdfunding for your products. So there's a group called Kickstarter. People know Kickstarter?
Yeah.
So, and there's some people try to do the same thing in medical. Now, the problem is that if your product is going to be FDA regulated, you will go to jail if you sell a product before it's FDA approved. Even if you pre-sell it, it's illegal. So just clarifying that. So as long as you don't think you're in that bucket, which could be gray, it's not very clear cut at the time where we are, you could pre-sell, and that has been successful, but only for direct-to-consumer with low price point. between $5 to maybe a few $100 price point, where people say, fine, if they don't do it, I don't go broke. Most of what we do is not really in that.
Well, Anne, have you seen some of the new crowdfunding portals? I think Health Tech Hatch is one, MedStarter is another, and I think you're right to delineate between crowdfunding as an approach for equity investment and some of the regulatory issues there versus the more consumer space, the more low-end cost products related to consumer health. I think that's where we're seeing some activity. And I will add from the federal government perspective, HHS Innovation Council, there is a subgroup that I'm on that we're exploring crowdfunding as an element, but in these delineated manners to really tap into this notion of crowdsourcing science and crowdsourcing health. So we're still in the early stages, but I think you've raised some good points around the issue.
And probably worth noting, one of the most successful and very recent mHealth crowdfunding stories is Misfit Wearables and their new activity tracker, Shine. If you don't know, the founder, Sunny Vu, one of the most successful mobile health guys, he created the blood glucose meter that goes into the iPhone, which is a cool product and was commercialized successfully. He now has this new company, and in 20 days sold $430,000 of activity trackers that haven't even been built yet. And so...
In fact, I bought one of them. I'm open-minded.
And that is a shout-out to Sunny. So.
But again, I mean, the concept is that it was me as a consumer, it was $100, and if they never ship, I don't go broke. So I think that one works. As long as what you're doing is consumer and something that's easy to explain and you can relate to.
Right. And I think Health Tech Hatch is an example of an interesting platform where the public can provide input to the project proposals and developers, and that provides for an element of input from the crowd, which it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the product quality. I think
the one last thing to just interrupt, that
yeah.
crowdfunding in a big definition is research funding, where we are basically, a lot of startups are reaching out to the consumer to collect the data, not at a clinical level, academic level, and that I think is a very, very powerful force that's coming out. And they're going to design the product and they're influencing the design of the services. That may be one of the revolution that's coming up.
Right. Well, with that, thank you very much for joining us, and let's give a big hand to our panelists.